Hello, everyone. Welcome to the fourth podcast on day 40, talking about ecosystems. In this podcast, we're going to talk about biogeochemical cycles and how these chemicals are recycled within an environment. And we'll focus on carbon. Let's go ahead and get started on this final podcast for day 40, closing up ecosystems. So I think it's important for us to begin by defining what a biogeochemical cycle is. Biogeochemical cycles are nutrient cycles. And as the name implies, we're talking about both biotic and abiotic factors. All of these factors have to be recycled. So we include them in this single term. There are four biogeochemical cycles that we should know, and you should know these four. One is the water cycle. The next is the phosphorus cycle. The third one is the nitrogen cycle. And the last one here is the carbon cycle. These are all very important and in the maintenance and the recycling of nutrients within in the ecosystem, how water is recycled, how phosphorus is recycled, how nitrogen, and then how carbon. So you should know the names of these four. However, we're going to focus on carbon. So any details with these cycles will be found in the carbon as far as what you need to know for the exam. You should look at figure 55.14. And more particularly, look at the carbon cycle found on page 1245. I'm going to walk through this, but you can use that as a reference. So it's important because carbon is the framework for all living things. Carbon is available to all forms of life. In photosynthetic organisms, so our autotrophs, it's available to them through CO2. In our heterotrophs, carbon is available to heterotrophs in their role as consumers, either because they eat the autotrophs, the primary producers, or because they eat other consumers, but they get that carbon through their heterotrophic feeding lifestyle. I should also mention that autotrophs also get sugar, carbon, through photosynthesis. Remember, part of the product of the Calvin cycle is generating organic molecules, and these organic molecules are used by the plant in its assimilation of various components. In addition, and I want to put this on the same slide, so I'm making a slightly different color just so we recognize it, all organisms release CO2 back into the atmosphere, back into the environment. All organisms are going to go through well, I should say most, but it's almost all. Most organisms will respire, and because they're respiring, they will generate CO2. Okay, next let's talk about reservoirs. These are places where carbon, in this case, can be stored and used within an ecosystem. Each of the biogeochemical cycles have reservoirs for phosphorus, for nitrogen, for water, but we're only going to focus on carbon here. Some of these major ones include the atmosphere, so the air we breathe that's around us, water systems like oceans, animal and plant biomass, fossils and fossil fuels, soil, and the last one I'm going to list is sedimentary rock. Sedimentary rock is not something we immediately think of as a place where we see a lot of carbon, but it turns out to be one of the largest stores of carbon that we find on the planet. However, it's very difficult to use, so it doesn't really get recycled from the rocks very quickly. It's a pretty slow cycling effect with the sedimentary rock, but it's still a reservoir. In fact, a large reservoir. Okay, let's talk more now about the cycling of CO2. So let's put CO2 here. And this is the reservoir we're going to talk about here is the air. So we can put that here too. CO2 found in the air we breathe. And that's in our atmosphere. CO2 is lost from the environment by various photosynthetic organisms, like in the oceans, we have phytoplankton. These are photosynthetic protists. CO2 is also lost from the air by photosynthetic organisms on land, like plants. Both plants and phytoplankton consume large amounts of CO2 from the air. However, the consumers, the animals that eat the plants and the animals that eat the other plants, so both on the land and consumers in the oceans, I'll just put water here, they replenish this carbon store through respiration. The plants do this as well through respiration, of course, as do the phytoplankton, because they both undergo respiration and photosynthesis. It turns out that this process of producers taking CO2 from the air balances pretty nicely with the amount of CO2 being released back into the environment through respiration. So, in a sense here, in a perfect world, this is balanced. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, so it's not balanced. Why is it not balanced? Well, to a large extent, it's due to the burning of fossil fuels. So you may have, various factories, maybe like a coal factory here. I'm not sure why that's a coal factory, but let's call this a coal factory. And it's releasing CO2 in the air. Maybe you have a vehicle, some kind of car, and it's releasing CO2 back into the air. Even burning wood, this is my burning wood, that releases CO2 back into the environment. And because of the extra addition of CO2 back into the environment, to a large extent it's by humans, perhaps maybe totally to humans, this now becomes unbalanced. This produces more CO2 in the environment than our autotrophs, our photosynthetic organisms, can consume. And the drawback to that is that we have extra CO2 in the environment, and CO2 is a greenhouse gas. We'll talk more about greenhouse gases next week, but for right now, what you should know is that this extra greenhouse gas in the environment will have long-term consequences to life on Earth, and highlighted by that is the fact that this extra greenhouse gases leads to global climate change. But you'll have to come back next week to get more on that. That ends this last podcast. If you have any questions for us, please make sure you come find us and we'll answer any questions you have. We'll see you in class. Bye.